2 years ago, I took what was arguably the most useful class in my entire 19 years of education. It was a class on negotiations at Harvard Business School. For this class, the professor personally interviewed Hillary Clinton about her negotiations with Vladimir Putin, Henry Kissinger about his negotiations to end the war in Vietnam, and also a former Harvard student who quite literally got caught by the KGB in the Soviet Union but managed to negotiate his way out. More about that later. In this video, I'm going to share the single most important lesson that I learned in this class. Just last week, applying this lesson saved me over $50,000. It also enabled me to raise capital for my startup at a $15 million valuation with just a pitch deck and no revenue at all. I don't think it's an exaggeration when I say that more than half of my net worth comes from things that I learned during this class. Being a good negotiator is one of the most valuable skills that you can acquire. Be it in a business setting, negotiating your salary, closing a sale, or getting out of a really tough situation. Or maybe you're negotiating your rent or the purchase price of a home. Or maybe something very simple day to day, like talking to your girlfriend about where to go for dinner or where to go on your next vacation. If you go on YouTube and search how to negotiate, you're going to find all sorts of videos from former FBI hostage negotiators talking about all these mental manipulation tricks, mind games, meeting objections, reading body language, and all sorts of tricks and tactics. I'm going to call these at the table tactics. And these are very important and they can obviously make or break a negotiation. However, the reason why you're likely not a good negotiator is not because you lack these tactics, which, by the way, almost anybody can learn. It's for very different reasons. What most people think a negotiation looks like is something like this.
Six.
3, and that's it, if I can sell it to the board.
5.
3.
All right. We'll call it an even 4, so it don't look so goddamn pathetic.
3. And not a dime more.
This may make a great movie scene, but when it comes to negotiation, that is really just a tip of the process. If you want to become a great negotiator, you need to master 3 different dimensions of negotiation. At the table tactics are the first dimension, and we've just seen that. The second dimension is called deal design, or as I like to call it, value creation. What you just watched was a clip from the movie Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps. And it's a completely wrong perception of how negotiations actually happen. Because people often think of negotiations being this very confrontational moment between two parties fighting over who gets how many pieces of the pie on the table. See, dividing a pie is a zero-sum game. For every piece that I get, you lose one. And if I want to make sure that I maximize my benefit at the end of the negotiation, I need to make sure that you leave the table with as few pieces of the pie as anyhow possible. The problem is, if this is how you approach a negotiation, you're almost certainly going to lose. Let me give you an example from last week. I flew down to Florida in order to buy a house and an apartment. They're both somewhere in this drone shot that I'm showing right now. And I was buying the house directly from a builder as it was brand new. And my first reaction, since I wanted to get a great deal, was that I should make sure I negotiate the purchase price down as much as possible. Luckily though, I had taken the Harvard negotiation class, so this is not what I did first. Instead, I reached out to my real estate agent as well as my co-founder who had bought a house in the same neighborhood just 1 year before me. And we focused on the second point of negotiations, value creation. Naively, you might think that purchasing a home is a zero-sum game. After all, for every dollar that I, as the buyer, manage to save, the seller is going to lose $1. So all I've got to do is make sure to negotiate the price down as much as possible. Wrong. Because think about it this way. Let's say I managed to negotiate $20,000 off the purchase price. It's great for me because, well, I saved $20,000. However, all house sales in the United States go into public record, which means that if I manage to get $20,000 off my home purchase, which is great for me, then a few weeks later, the next guy comes along and wants to buy a similar house to mine from the same construction company. He's going to say, wait a minute, that guy Samuel, he managed to get $20,000 off. I want at least $15,000 off my home, or otherwise I'm not going to buy it. And then the next guy comes along and wants to get a discount as well, and so on and so on and so on. And just like that, in order for me to gain $20,000, the construction company loses an extra $100,000 in future money. That's exactly the opposite of value creation. You see, negotiating in 2 dimensions means that you first want to increase the pie as much as possible and then divide it. And by me gaining an extra $20,000, And a construction company losing an extra $120,000 in total money means that the pie just shrank by $100,000. That's not value creation. Obviously, they're going to say no to this deal. Instead, we focused on increasing the size of the pie as much as possible. When we sat at a table with a construction company, instead of trying to lower the price, we actually offered them an extra $8,000 in purchase price. Now, why did we do that? Well, you see, just like lowering the purchase price has a snowball effect on future sales and costs them future money, increasing the price also makes a snowball effect. It might actually give them some future revenue. Let's say an extra $50,000 in future sales. And just like that, we've increased the pie by an extra $50,000. And now there's more on the table that I get to take. In exchange for increasing the price by $8,000, we asked them to, first of all, cover up to $24,000 worth of closing costs. And since this doesn't enter public records, all this really costs them is, well, $24,000 and nothing in the future. Secondly, we asked them to issue a 1-year warranty for the house, which doesn't cost them much either because they already have construction people in the area, but it means a lot to me. And thirdly, we asked them to pay money to the bank that lends the loan for this apartment, for the house, to increase the current interest rate from 6.8%, which is market rate, to just 4.99%. And that altogether turns a bad deal into a great deal because it makes such a big difference. Unsurprisingly, they said yes to this offer. If I hadn't found out that a seller can pay money to a bank to lower interest rates, which I didn't even know was possible, we would have never proposed this, and therefore this deal would have never happened. And similarly, about 3 years ago, when I got my really beautiful apartment at Harvard University that I made a tour of, by the way, which you can check out here, I asked the landlord if they would lower the rent by $300 a month. That's not a big ask because it's such an expensive apartment, but nevertheless, they said no. And then I got back to them and said, hey, how about on a 12-month lease, you give me 1 month free? That's actually a much bigger ask, effectively asking for $800 per month off. And they said yes to that. Now, why would they say yes to a bigger discount than to a smaller discount? Again, it's about value creation, understanding their incentives. If they lower the rent by $300, they have 7 other apartments in the same building that they might have to lower in the future as well because people talk. But if they give me a free month of rent, they don't really have to disclose this and they can tell everyone, well, I pay this high rent, so they can charge the same amount of money for the other apartments, and therefore they actually make more money in the future. Again, value creation. Increase the pie as much as possible, and only then try to get as many slices of it as you can. Here's another practical example. Let's say you and your partner are talking about where to go on your next vacation. Now, you might love food, really good food, and therefore you propose France. And your partner might really like nice beaches and therefore proposes the Dominican Republic. Now, if you don't really think too much, you might just start starting to argue between these two, whether you go to France or the Dominican Republic, and whoever wins this argument, the other person will be just really unhappy about it. But if you actually think for a moment, what are the incentives of the other side, and you start to understand that one person really cares about the food, the other person really cares about the beaches, and that's their reason for why they proposed what they proposed, you might think if there's maybe a third option that actually creates overall value. A country with great food and great beaches, such as, for example, Croatia, where I'm from. You should go there, it's a really nice country. And with that idea, you will both be happy, maybe just slightly less happy than if you had gotten your first option, but at least nobody's going to leave the negotiation table being completely unhappy. And value creation goes far beyond money. Oftentimes, it's not even about the money. People might care about boosting their reputation or just sparing them from some embarrassment. Or maybe completely off the negotiation table, you can call in a favor with someone to help your counterparty with something completely unrelated that might mean a lot to them, but cost you very little. Okay, that sounded like I'm trying to tell you that you should bribe people. That's not what I'm suggesting, but there might be legal ways that you can help someone out in exchange get something out of them without breaking the law. Keep that in mind. It all just boils down to doing your research and completely understanding what matters to the other side. All this takes a lot of time, but usually it's worth it. And sometimes, when you're dealing with a friendly counterparty who's really intelligent, you can actually explain to them that you're trying to do value creation. And once they understand this concept, you can very openly disclose what actually matters to you, assign different weights to all the different parameters, because usually you're negotiating about more than just one number. And then you can actually find a great solution that allows you to find the biggest pie that you can possibly divide. But again, this only works if you're dealing with a friendly and honest counterparty. During my class at Harvard Business School, the professor divided us into groups of 2. We were all given different companies to represent. So my friend and I were given 2 opposing parties in a negotiation, and we were each given a lot of information about our own company that we needed to understand in terms of what priorities mattered to us in the negotiation process. We had 30 minutes to close a deal, which we did, and then after 30 minutes the professor collected all the data from all the different students, and he actually showed us that almost all of us left a lot of money on the table. Almost all of us could have gotten away with much better deals for both sides, so bigger cake in total, but we didn't just because we lacked the information about the other side. We didn't trust each other enough to really disclose this, and therefore both ended up with a worse deal. So far we discussed the first dimension, which is negotiation tactics. Second dimension is value creation, a good deal design. And the third dimension, which my professor at Harvard believes to be most important, is the setup. The setup are all the different moves that you make ahead of the negotiations. You want to make sure that you're talking to the right parties, the right people from the right parties, in the right sequence, at the right time, at the right place, and you have the right backup option in case of a no deal. Someone who was really good at a third dimension of the negotiations, the setup, was the KGB, the spy agency of the Soviet Union. Earlier in this video I told you about this guy who went there and had to bargain with the KGB for his life. His name is a real guy, by the way. His name is Bruce Allen. He came to the negotiation class once at Harvard, and he used to do his PhD at Harvard back in the 80s. And during that time, he was writing his PhD thesis about the Soviet Union. Now, he really wanted to go to Moscow to do his research there. However, normally visas are not granted for such purposes during the time of the Soviet Union. However, in his case, they surprisingly made an exception and he went to Moscow and started his studies there. One day, he accepted an invitation from a trusted Russian friend to go to the outskirts of Moscow for a nice lunch. And when he arrived there were a bunch of friendly Russian people. They were all sitting in a room, having great food, and of course, tons of alcohol. And after a couple of hours of just joking around and having fun, all people in this room except one left. And all of a sudden, he was alone with this guy named Vladimir, of course. And as soon as they went out, this guy Vladimir looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'm a high-ranking KGB officer. I have been commissioned to make you a proposal." Imagine the fear in his eyes. All of a sudden, he's completely alone, completely defenseless. He probably knows that the KGB is listening. Everything was staged. He was completely set up. He was alone with this guy, probably armed, with other people outside, no idea what to do, and to make everything worse, he was completely drunk. Vladimir, the KGB officer, wanted him to become a spy for the Soviet Union. And given that Vladimir had just purposefully exposed himself, it was very clear to Bruce that he couldn't just say no, walk out of the room, and count on making it home alive. From the KGB's perspective, this was a brilliant setup. Evil, but really smart. Luckily, Bruce was a very smart negotiator, and he somehow, with a lot of effort, managed to negotiate his way out of this without having to become a spy for the Soviet Union and making it home alive. Funny enough, Bruce nowadays still teaches at Harvard, and he's the head of the Russia Negotiation Initiative, teaching a lot of negotiation class at Harvard. This is a very extreme example, and I strongly advise you against putting people in uncomfortable situations in order to negotiate with them. It can really just backfire. However, this example brilliantly illustrates the power of a strong setup. It's a bit like stacking the deck of cards in your favor to maximize your chances of winning a game. Here are some practical ways to master this setup. Number 1, identify decision makers. Let's say you're representing your startup and trying to close some deal with a big corporation. Now, you might be sitting across the table from some mid-level manager. But what you might not know is that that mid-level manager, first of all, is just trying to not do anything wrong, get fired, and has very limited decision power. So instead of talking to this person, you could try to network your way up to the CEO, and once you talk to an actual decision maker who has much more leeway in giving you what you want, you might leave with a much better deal. Number 2, build relationships beforehand. Instead of just talking to someone who you don't know, you might try to spend some time networking with them, meeting them in some non-pressure, high-stakes environment, connecting to them on social media and just getting to know them. Because once you know them better and you have some mutual trust, it's much easier to do value creation than when you don't really know what some people's true intentions are. Number 3, sequence negotiations strategically. There are many negotiations that involve a lot of different parties. So for example, if you're a real estate developer and you want to buy a lot of land and start some new construction there, this land might be owned by different stakeholders. So instead of just talking to the biggest stakeholder, what you could do is talk to all the small parties first, negotiate with them, build some momentum, and then you can talk to the key stakeholders who will have a much easier time saying yes when everyone else is already on board. Number 4, and hence your BATNA, which stands for Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement. For example, when I was raising capital, I was negotiating with some VC about closing the deal and about the terms and all of that. But instead of just talking to them, I continued talking to other VCs, so in case this one deal fell through, I had alternatives. This also gave me a much better leverage and negotiation position than if I had really just one option. Number 5, time your negotiation appropriately. For example, you want to ask for a raise. You're not just going to walk into your manager's office and ask for it. Instead, you should wait for some key accomplishment, either from your side or from the company's side, and then do it. It makes a huge difference, and people are much more willing to give you more if they just received more. Number 6, prepare for cultural and interpersonal differences. For example, you're making some international deal with people who live in different countries. In some cultures, it's just customary that you need to first build a relationship before you can actually talk business. And if you're just skipping over that and you think you can do your business very quickly, you might just come off as cold and calculated, and people might just be much less likely to actually give you a good deal just because they don't trust you for these cultural reasons. The key takeaway here is that an effective negotiation is not just about what happens at the table, but about everything that happens before and how you set up the stage in order to maximize the likelihood of reaching a good deal for both parties. If you're interested in this and want to learn more, I highly recommend Professor James Sebenius' book called 3D Negotiations. One struggle with many negotiations is the fact that you're dealing with uncertainties. Oftentimes, you don't really know what is going to happen, and yet you need to make your decisions based on this limited information available to you. Therefore, you need to become extremely good at intuitively understanding probabilities and making informed, intelligent decisions based on the limited information you have. A great place to learn to intuitively understand probabilities is with Brilliant.org, who kindly agreed to sponsor this video. Brilliant is a platform for learning by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data science, AI, and others. A great place to get started is with their interactive course on predicting with probabilities. For example, let's check out the chapter on probabilities with conditions. Oftentimes, you learn new information during a negotiation, and therefore you have to act quickly and understand how this new information impacts the probabilities of different outcomes. For example, you know that in the United States, only 2% of all flights get canceled. However, you're waiting at the airport and all of a sudden you realize it starts to snow. Is the probability still 2%? Intuitively, you probably know that the answer is no, because it's snowing after all. But what you can do here is you can use their interactive data set and actually verify this information based on real information. To try everything Brilliant has to offer free of charge for the first 30 days, just go to brilliant.org/SamuelBosch or click on the link in the description. You're also going to get a 20% discount off their annual premium subscription. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up for the algorithm, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notifications. With that, wishing you best of luck with all of your future negotiations. Take care.